Welcome to history class again. Um, I, I'm hoping, and I think most of you have submitted your essays and your tests, and they go to Learn, um, and hopefully the turnaround time will be rapid, and so you'll get your work back. Um, and I would say that you, in terms of sort of appeals, and if you don't think the grading was appropriate, first of all, you contact the grader, and then you contact me, and then you if you're not satisfied, you can go to the department. There's a whole process, and frankly, you should take advantage of it um, if you feel you haven't been properly graded. Are there any questions about any of this? Good. So today I want to again start with a review question, and then we're going to, I have several more remarks to make about the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd century. As I explained, it's the high point of the Roman Empire. And then we're going to turn to the history of Christianity, the development of Christianity within the empire. So that's the agenda. How far we'll get, we'll see. So to begin with, we're doing question 17. What was the historical significance of the conquest of Alexander the Great? Well, I can sum them up. It meant the end of the independence of the Greek city-states. Secondly, the destruction of the Persian Empire. And finally, the unification of the whole of the ancient world into a single entity. Of course, this didn't quite work out. And what we see is it splits into 3 parts, and there is the Hellenistic age. But it forecasts eventually the Roman Empire, which is to come, which does, in the end, succeed in fully knitting together the ancient world. But in terms of answering the question, those certainly should be the dominant themes. But you want to tell me the dates. Alexander took power in 336. He died in 322. It was a short but very important career. He launched this adventure certainly for personal glory, and very much in sort of Greek ideas about heroism, military prowess, and so on. He also was influenced by the idea that the Greeks were in perennial war against the Persians, the kind of continuation of their wars that had begun at the beginning of the 5th century. But as time wore on, of course, the unification of the East and West became the principal idea that he was, in effect, going to unite the world of the East, the Oriental world, with the Greek West. And you should basically mention the fact that he took as his bride a Persian princess. He created 25 Greek city-states, the first of many. These were the first of many others to come in order to establish the Greek presence in the East. He restructured both the army and the bureaucracy to include both Persians and Greeks. He orientalized the court ceremonial. He carried out the marriage of the 9,000. 9,000 of his the soldiers were married to Persian women. And at the end of the day, he initiated the Hellenistic age, which we discussed. So that's the answer to this review question, question 17. Are there any questions that you have about this item? Okay. Now, I was talking about the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd century. And this is called the Principate, after the name of the emperor was Princeps, and first citizen. And this was it's appropriate because the empire was based on a great deal of carryover from the Republican period. There was a lot of self-government, although of course the emperor had the last word. And so the emperor is basically being called the first citizen of the state. There's a harking back to the Republic. Well, in any case, this period is a period of certainly there were revolts. I've explained the Jewish revolt, the revolt of the slaves under Spartacus, but in general, the common people had been suppressed. After the fall of the Gracchi, most of the class war basically disappeared, and the patricians, the landlord class, the elites, had it all their own way. There was this 2-century period of relative peace, we could say, and it was buttressed by the fact that the whole of the Roman Empire, whose extent was enormous, became a free trade zone, and there was a certain division of labor in the economy, and merchants were trading all over this area freely, and so the economy actually grew during this period of the 1st and 2nd century, almost to the end. Nevertheless, I want to signal that even in the midst of this, certain problems, which were going to become extremely important after the 2nd century, latent problems, which in my view play a large role in the ultimate crisis of the Roman Empire. I want to signal these problems. And this, of course, is quite important. The whole question of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is a classic problem. Why did Rome fail? Why did Rome decline? The British asked themselves, the Americans asked themselves, the Germans asked themselves, because they had these imperial aspirations. So and they all went to school where they were taught all about this. That is to say, the politicians who went to the elite schools learned all about this. So they were very concerned about this. And the most famous work, of course, is The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, which is a literary masterpiece. It's still an interesting work from a historical point of view, but especially he was a brilliant writer at the end of the 18th century, and Gibbon's work is still worth looking at, checking out, okay? In any case, well, what were some of these problems? Well, in the first place, there was this enormous inequality in the empire between the rich and the poor, huge gap between the rich and the poor, which spilled over. Well, that isn't necessarily fatal. It often is, and maybe it will be fatal in the case of the society that we live in. But the thing is that it had implications in terms of the actual operation of the economy, in that, yes, the Roman Empire was a free trade zone, a common market, but very few people had the money to buy anything in this market. The slaves, the peasants, their contact with the market was virtually non-existent. And therefore, the great bulk of the population at its height, we're talking about 70 million people, could not become customers. And so the economic foundations of the political unity of the empire, this market was, from an economic point of view, very important to the political existence of the empire. But as I say, the market was weak, it wasn't strong. The interdependency, the economic interdependency was relatively limited. And indeed, in many places, the sort of overall connections between the eastern part of the empire and the western part of the empire were relatively weak. There was a tendency to self-sufficiency within the economy, or as it's sometimes referred to as autarky, which means self-sufficiency in the economy. And as we know, ultimately the empire broke apart. The Western Empire collapsed under the weight of the invasions of the Germans. The Eastern Empire carried on, but there was over time, and by the 4th or 5th century, becoming evident, the unity of the empire was imperiled by the fact that underneath the market was weak, and actually it was growing weaker as the decline of the empire proceeded. So that was an important weakness. The second weakness I would point to is the relationship between the towns and the countryside. The rural people, the peasants and the slaves in the countryside, and the towns. Now, this harks back even to the Greek period, but it became strong. This tendency became strong in the Hellenistic period, and is still stronger in the Roman period. The landlords, the elites, the patricians, the merchants, the craftsmen, they all lived in the towns. And the countryside, under supervisors, was left to the peasants and the slaves. And essentially, the towns basically lived off the food and surpluses which were produced by the peasants and the slaves in the countryside. There was this basic split, and we could say that even the towns were parasitic on the countryside because the towns didn't give anything back. There was no sort of reciprocal relationship between the towns and the country. And I raise this point because starting at the beginning of modern times, that is, say, in the 16th century, this changed. One of the fundamental characteristics of the capitalist economy that emerged in the 16th century was that the towns manufactured commodities which were made available to people living in the countryside. And the countryside provided essentially food and raw materials for the manufacturers in the town. Well, manufacturing, there was manufacturing, but it was weak in antiquity under the Romans. And so this kind of parasitic relationship between towns and countries, town and country, was another weakness. A third weakness was slavery. The economy, it's estimated that in central Italy, for example, 30% of the rural population were slaves. And the numbers were even, the proportion was even greater in southern Italy and in Sicily. Well, harking back to what I said about the Greeks and technology, the Romans certainly did develop, did create certain machines. They did, especially for purposes of war, but they also did, for example, they produced some pumps and other pulleys and so on to do work. But in general, work was left to the slaves. You didn't need sophisticated technology. So you could say, well, what happens if there are no slaves or there are fewer and fewer? Well, that's exactly what happened. Starting in the late 2nd century AD, there was a steady die-off. I said there were 70 million people at the height of the empire. Well, plagues, malnourishment ultimately took their toll. And starting in the late 2nd century and getting worse in the 3rd century and forward, there was a decline in population, including slaves. So the slaves ran out and they had no machinery. Machineries are called mechanical slaves. There was no machinery to replace the slaves. And so slavery ultimately deeply weakened the empire. I want to say one more thing about the Roman Empire. As I said, it was basically the people who had a good time, who had fun, were the upper class. It sounds like today. They lived really well, extremely well. And the thing is that the ordinary people did not. Even under the peace, the Roman peace and the economic growth, they didn't really see a significant improvement, as to say, the ordinary people. There was no improvement. In fact, people were quite vulnerable. I saw figures that, for example, in terms of mortality, people lived on average to the average. Some people obviously lived to an old age, but 25 years old, 25 years was the average age of people within the Roman Empire. Some pretty sophisticated history has gone into these estimates. 25 years old. Well, that suggests great vulnerability of the population. The government didn't take care of the people. The government, it cared less about the people. People were, you could discard them. Who cared about a slave? Maybe the immediate owner, but there was no overview that you needed to take care of the population. The population, most of the population did all the work, take care of it. And we see that, I am going to say this, why not? You see, this was particularly the case starting when the Great Plagues struck the Roman Empire. In 160 AD, a great plague, a bubonic plague, broke out, and it lasted to 185 AD. And then again, in the middle of the 3rd century, there was another great plague, and there was a huge die-off of the population. And it's very suggestive in terms of like this COVID thing is really, a lot of people are thinking about it and its implications. But notice that which are the two countries in the Western world where the mortality has been the greatest, and the the problems have become so serious? It's England and the United States. These are the most capitalist countries in the world. Which of the biggest countries in the world has done best? China, in terms of taking care of its people. And get beyond the rhetoric, folks. They can talk day and night about freedom and democracy and all the rest of it. But what actually happens to the common people is, for me at least, the determinant of whether a society is a good society or not. I'll stop with that and carry on. So let's turn to the next world. Let's talk about Christianity and um, um, the roots of Christianity, where it comes from and how it developed. And what's amazing about Christianity, of course, it developed an obscure part of the Roman Empire amongst the lowest strata of the population, and it was at the beginning a very egalitarian religion. Some writers even suggested that the early Christians were socialists. I don't really think that that's true, but they were highly egalitarian. And in particular, they provided for one another. There was within the Christian church a lot of charity. And believe me, charity was very necessary. One of the fundamental things that Christianity provided was charity, some mercy in a merciless world. And when, as the Roman Empire did, when it fell into crisis, people turned to the church. And ultimately, I would say, certainly in the West and even in the eastern part of the empire, the church became the major institution of society by the late fourth, fifth century AD, which is a remarkable. The whole of the empire basically became Christian by the fifth century AD, and it's a remarkable story which I want to tell. So, to begin with, we should note, and certainly one of my motives for stressing the history of Judaism, it has its own interest, but you cannot understand Christianity without understanding the Jewish background. The Jewish background. Christianity emerged amongst the Jews as a great heresy amongst the Jews. I'll have more to say about it in a little while. But also some of the basic foundation stones of Christianity were drawn from Judaism. So we have to talk about this. So first of all, the Jews had developed the idea that history had a meaning. The Greeks and the Romans, their view of well, you could ask the question, well, what is history? There's so many incidents I've narrated and so on, and generation after generation, it seems quite meaningless and so on. But as I have explained, the Jews came to the view that, in fact, history, the Romans and the Greeks basically said, well, history is simply part of nature. Societies, states rise and fall, just like there is a season, there's a springtime, there's a summer, there's a fall, and then there's winter. Everything dies off in the winter. Well, the same thing is true of societies. In other words, the Greeks and Romans believed in that history was a cycle. History moved in a cycle, round and round and round. it was part of nature in that way. But no, the Jews said, no, history has a progressive meaning. It's a meaningful story. And this story looks ultimately to basically the God, and there is only a single God, a monotheistic idea, is in control of history, and history will be determined by the will of God. So they had what we call a providential view of history. God's providence determines the historical fate of humanity. And in particular, the Jews had this idea that within this context in which God ultimately determines everything, all the events that flow, they, the Jews, were the chosen people. Well, the Christians, and you'll see how this happened, picked up this idea of the chosen people. The Jewish idea was the Jews had made a covenant back in the time of Moses with God. And this covenant meant that the God looked particularly with favor on the Jewish people. Well, the Christians said, hey, yes, that was the old covenant, but with the coming of Jesus, with the life and death of Jesus, there is a new covenant. And the new chosen people are the Christians. The Jews are no longer the chosen people. It's the Christians, by virtue of the life and death of Jesus Christ, who can save humanity. There is a new covenant, and the new chosen people are the Christians. So you see this reinterpretation of Judaism, which was there almost from the beginning of the Christian faith. Now, let's look at Palestine in the period of Jesus. Here you basically see Judea here. Up here is Galilee. This is where Jesus was born, up here in the north. This Palestine had been ruled since, it was first under the just give me a chance. Well, Palestine had been ruled by, I mentioned these people before, the Hasmonean dynasty. They overthrew the Greeks and they established an independent Jewish monarchy back in the 2nd century BC, 2nd century, 200 to 100 BC. In the middle of the 2nd century, the Romans began to obtrude, they began to move in. And the Roman policy became, let the Jews have their state, but we're going to control things behind the scenes. They made the kings of the Jewish kings, the Hasmoneans, basically puppets, and that was the situation. The Romans were behind the scenes in control, while this Hasmonean Jewish dynasty ruled in Palestine. in 37 BC, they basically behind the scenes chose one of the Hasmonean family. His name was Herod the king, Herod. They named him as their puppet. He was continuing this line of kings. But Herod, in particular, became very hated, and he's mentioned in the New Testament as particularly hateful. He insisted on very central control over the population. He raised their taxes. Um, his lifestyle was entirely pagan. He was a Jew only in name only. In fact, he practiced a Roman and a Greek way of life. He very much admired the Greeks and the Romans, and like so many of the elite in the ancient world. And so, well, the rest of the population in Palestine who were Jews were furious at the fact that he was a pagan, as they saw it. And his subservience to Rome made the Jews furious. In other words, there was a lot of nationalism. Has anything changed? There was a lot of nationalism amongst the Jews. I'm, of course, referring to the state of Israel, etc. There was a lot of nationalism amongst the Jews. Now, the nationalism kept getting worse and worse. And so when Herod died and the Romans sought to appoint yet another Hasmonean as a king, the situation politically was spinning out of control. And so in 6 AD, the Romans stepped in directly and established direct rule over Judea. It came under the direct rule of the Roman state, and a series of governors were appointed. And so the sort of Jewish monarchy comes to an end, and direct Roman rule is established. There is a governor who rules from northern Palestine, a place called Caesarea. It's a very beautiful Greco-Roman town, Caesarea. This is where the Romans ruled. Of course, the Jewish capital was Jerusalem. Well, in 26 AD, the Romans appointed a new governor or procurator governor by the name of Pontius Pilate. And he is the guy who basically presided over the trial of Jesus. Pontius Pilate, Pilate. Now, as I said, there was a lot of political and social opposition to Roman rule. And I want to mention again, I've mentioned this before, there was, the Jews were divided. There were various parties, political parties, you could call them, in this increasingly volatile situation. Now, one of the parties, which were called Pharisees, these were the rabbis. The leaders of this were the rabbis, and their base was the synagogue. They had developed from basically the beginning of the 2nd century, what we call synagogue Judaism. Synagogue Judaism had developed. It was popular. People went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and presiding were these rabbis. And this was popular amongst merchants and wealthy craftsmen and so on in the cities. So you have these Pharisees. But more establishment, richer, wealthier people basically were from the landlord class, were the so-called Sadducees. The Sadducees were the priestly landlord class. The priests own a huge amount of land. Today, if you run into somebody named Cohn, who obviously would be a Jew, the Cohn means priest in Hebrew, and these people are the descendants of this priestly class. This is carried on in these families who are known as Cohn. It doesn't really have that much significance, except from a historical point of view, but nevertheless, it's an interesting point. In the sense that it shows you this sort of antiquity of these people. In any case, so you have these two establishment parties, I would say, the synagogue Pharisaic element and in the cities, and you have the Kohanim, the priests, who essentially control the temple and the temple lands, which were extensive. Beyond these two groups, amongst the lower classes, some of the artisans and the peasants, there were the nationalists, the Jewish nationalists, who basically were highly political and they wanted to rebel against the Romans. They were called the Zealots. And today, of course, anybody who's a political fanatic is called a zealot. And that's what these people were. They were political fanatics and they wanted a revolution against Roman control. And finally, the last group were known as the Essenes. These are very small groups. Maybe there were 20 of them, but they're interesting because they lived out in the desert. They lived a completely ascetic life. They barely ate and drank and worked communally. They shared everything. They were communistically, they ran communes. And basically, they said the end of the world is imminent. The Messiah is coming to save the Jews. And they're important to Christianity because there's strong evidence to believe that, for example, John the Baptist, who baptized Jesus, was such an Essene. And so there seems to be a close connection between these communistic Jews with their notion of the end of the world and John the Baptist and Jesus. So there are these four groups: the priests, the rabbis, the zealots, and the Essenes, who all play a certain part in the background to Jesus. And of course, a lot of Jews, certainly not the priests, who for them, Judaism was all about the ritual in the temple. But certainly the Essenes and the Pharisees and the Zealots, they all believed that God's intervention into the world was imminent, that a Messiah, who they conceived of as a kind of spiritual King David. Certainly this Messiah would come, he would have a sword, but he was seen as a direct messenger from God. I mean, the original King David was essentially a worldly figure. He was a general. But we're talking about a kind of spiritual general who would enter from heaven and set things right. This is their concept of the Messiah. But what I'm trying to get at is that this notion that the world as we know it, with all its oppressions and contradictions, its last days were imminent, and God would soon come, and the heavenly kingdom would arrive. This is what we call the coming of the apocalypse. And of course, a lot of people even today say, for example, fundamentalist Christians believe in this idea that the world is imminently coming to an end. Now, I want to add one other thing about the Jews, and that is most of them actually didn't even live in Palestine anymore. from the time of the Babylonian captivity, many Jews immigrated to Mesopotamia and to Egypt, to Syria, to Asia Minor, to Greece, and even to Rome. The Jews were scattered all over the Mediterranean and throughout the Middle East, and these Jews were different from the majority in Palestine. In Palestine, they were farmers, but in the so-called diaspora, that is to say, outside of Palestine, most of them were merchants and artisans. And this is when, well, we know that in terms of the history of the Jews in the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, and into modern times, they were merchants and artisans. Well, this already started back at the time of Jesus, the so-called Jewish diaspora. In other words, the Jews as a people changed character from being essentially farmers into being merchants and craftsmen at this time. Well, this was the context in which Jesus was born, and we don't really know the exact date. There's a certain amount of speculation. Some scholars argue that it was around the third year, 3 AD is it's called, 3 AD, the possible date in which Jesus was born. And of course, he grew up in Galilee amongst the peasants. And in the course of time, he assumed the role of being a teacher, that is to say, teaching God's will, but also being a prophet. For example, he would announce in terms of when he preached that it was important to repent because the end of the world was near, was coming. This idea is a common prophetic idea. He also went around and seemed to have a certain capacity to heal and work miracles. He seems to have been a healer and a miracle worker. We could say, though, that there were several of these characters are mentioned in the written text that we have. He was not unique in this way. Well, as time wore on, what did begin to change is some people began to say, well, he's not really a teacher, prophet, miracle worker, and so on. In fact, he is the long-awaited Messiah. Some people began to say King David is returning through the person of Jesus. This idea began to become current amongst people. He was popular, and he was popular above all amongst the peasantry and amongst the craftsmen. Now, we also know that, of course, he preached in a very powerful way. Obviously, the most famous sermon is the Sermon on the Mount, which is a classic sermon. It's a brilliant sermon. We scholars have determined, yes, there's a certain rabbinical influence. Some of the more spiritual rabbis seem to have had some effect on it, but we can say that the simplicity and universality of his preaching, the ethics are so pure, so simple, and so poetically expressed that clearly he was some sort of spiritual genius, we can say. Well, in any case, of course, as his mission went on, he attracted more and more attention, more and more of a following, and he began to excite the fear of the authorities. The authorities became increasingly alarmed at his activities because they were, above all, fearful that this preaching would assume a political form. Remember, I said that there was so much unrest, political unrest, challenges to the Romans, and so on. there was a growing fear that his activity would take a political form. And so, of course, when he came to Jerusalem, he was arrested by the Romans with the complicity of um, the Sadducees, the priests, but also certainly some of the rabbis were involved um, in his arrest. And what was he charged with? Well, he was charged with attacking the temple. Um, he was charged with some sort of political conspiracy. And last but not least, um, that he claimed to be indeed the Messiah, being sent by God. Um, and so it was that in the year 33 AD, there's some dispute about the year of the crucifixion, 33. It's possible that it was the year 30 or even 29, but we can say 33. He was crucified, which was a common form of execution on the part of the Romans. Now, uh, there's two things to be said now. First of all, it's clear that at the very first, the birth of this new religion, the essence of it was that the Messiah had come, that Jesus was the Messiah. Um, on the other hand, this is an entirely Jewish context we're talking about. This is going on in Jerusalem. Everybody is a Jew here, except for some of the Roman soldiers. And so the early church, the disciples and their followers, of whom there were not many at the beginning, were all Jews, and they practiced Judaism. And this is very important. They continued to practice the ceremonies, the synagogue, and the rituals, and so on. They continued to. They were Jews. That was their framework. But they just said that the Messiah had come, and in fact, the early church's headquarters was Jerusalem. The leaders, of course, we know there's two individuals, Peter and James. James was the brother of Jesus, but also Peter the fisherman were the two most important. And they were Jews, and that was their view of things. Um, now, certainly, what is amazing though is that, and I'm sort of going to maybe this will be the climax of what I have to say. I want you to imagine what this must have been like, because we're talking about people who are Jews, and suddenly they say that the Messiah is amongst us. The Messiah has come, and the last days are coming. The Messiah has come. Everything is going to change. Well, the rabbis and the priests went crazy. And of course, the Roman authorities were very alarmed. But what I want to stress is the bravery of these people, because the persecution that developed against them, the hostility in the Jewish community was enormous. And yet they defied everybody, and this was their belief. And of course, as the persecution developed of this heresy amongst the Jews, bitterness set in, and you do see that, for example, there was another disciple, Stephen, who began to attempt to attack the temple religion and so on. You do need to notice this. But the guy who really changed everything was actually one of the central persecutors. His name was Saul, and he was, in essence, a young rabbi, and he was a fanatic, and he wanted to exterminate all of these heretics, these Christian heretics. But lo and behold, he experienced a sudden conversion, and it is this character who changed his name to the Greek name Paul. From Saul, he became Paul, who in terms of the essential beliefs of the Christians, He is the second founder of the Christian religion, and we'll pick up this narrative in the next class. Have a nice day, everybody.